The word Mongol conjures a very specific image: cavalry on the steppe, cities in ash, stacks of skulls outside the walls of Baghdad. Is not wrong. The Mongol armies of the 13th century inflicted some of the most densely documented mass violence in the pre-modern record of, and the scale of what they destroyed is not exaggerated, under the command of. But there is a different question you can ask: what actually let the Mongols hold what they took? A conquest empire dies the moment the conquerors ride home. Most of them do. Conquest without administration is just raiding at scale, the command of. The Mongols built something different, something that let them govern territory from Korea to the Black Sea for the better part of a century. That infrastructure had a name. It was called the Yam, under the command of, and the Yam is the story that most histories of the Mongols put in a footnote. The standard account deserves to be steel, manned before we complicate it. Armies. Under Genghis Khan and his successors in the 13th century built the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history. The military system behind that was not crude. The cavalry tactics were sophisticated. Feigned retreats, flanking operations conducted over miles under the command of coordinated movements between separated columns that required a level of operational communication most armies of the period couldn't manage. The intelligence gathering ahead of campaigns was systematic. Mongol commanders gathered information on roads, water sources, and local political divisions before committing to major operations. The siege engineering, much of it adapted from Chinese and Persian specialists who were conscripted or defected, let Mongol armies take walled cities that steppe cavalry alone could not breach. And the deliberate use of terror, the publicized destruction of cities that resisted versus the calculated pardoning of cities that surrendered, was strategic policy, designed to empty the calculation for defenders before an assault began. The conquest story is not myth. The Mongol military was genuinely formidable and genuinely innovative within the military logic of the 13th century. The question is whether conquest explains what came after. The Yam, the word likely derives from a Mongolian or Turkic root related to road or route, was a relay station network built across Mongol-controlled territory. The basic design was operationally simple. At intervals along major roads, the Mongol administration established stations. Each station maintained fresh horses, supplies, fodder, and personnel. A courier carrying official credentials, a tablet of authority that Persian sources call a paisa, could ride to a station under the command of, exchange their exhausted mount for a fresh one, and continue without meaningful delay. The cumulative effect was that a message could travel from the Mongol heartland in Central Asia to a distant provincial governor at speeds that no early empire at comparable geographic scale had achieved. This was not primarily about imperial mail in the modern sense. It was about administrative reach, under the command of. The Yam was how the center stayed in contact with the periphery across distances measured in thousands of miles, Bung under the command of. Persian administrative sources from the Ilkhanate, the Mongol successor state controlling Persia and Iraq, describe the system in considerable operational detail, under the command of, because provincial governors were required to maintain the stations within their jurisdictions and subject to censure when they failed. Chinese dynastic records from the Yuan period. The Mongol ruled Chinese dynasty established in the latter half of the 13th century. Document the eastern branches of the network with enough specificity that scholars have been able to reconstruct approximate station, distributions, and course, provision requirements, Verwaltungsklöster requirements. The practical consequences of the yam were structural, not incidental. Military intelligence arrived while it was still actionable. A regional commander facing an uprising could get word to the center and receive a response. In days rather than the weeks or months it would take without relay infrastructure. Tax assessments, census returns, complaints from subject populations, reports of crop failures or banditry. All of this could move faster than any administration governing comparable territory had previously managed. That last point is worth sitting with. On the Mongol Empire at its peak stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Eastern Europe. The Roman Empire at its height governed a much smaller geographic footprint. Command of. The Achaemenid Persian Empire is perhaps the closest earlier parallel in terms of extent, and the Persians also maintained royal road systems. Under the command of. What the Yam did at Mongol scale was make central authority not merely a claim, but a functioning reality, however imperfect and extractive that authority was. Travelers who crossed Mongol, controlled territory in the mid-13th century noted the system's effects directly. A Flemish friar named William of Rubruck, command of, who made the journey to the Mongol capital in the 1250s and left one of the more detailed and critically minded contemporary accounts, described the relative predictability of travel along official routes. A predictability that depended on the stations being maintained and supplied under the command of, which in turn depended on the administrative obligations imposed on subject populations. Under the command of, the evidence for the yam comes primarily from administrative and chronicle sources in Persian and Chinese. Persian administrative literature from the late 13th century treats year maintenance as a core obligation of provincial governance. There are records of officials being held accountable for stations fell into disrepair or fails to provide required horse quotas. Our major Persian chronicle, compiled under Mongol patronage in the early 14th century, gives organized attention to the system's structure, alongside the more dramatic political and military narratives. Yuan Chinese administrative documents, the kind of routine bureaucratic record that survives in bulk from literate. Paper, using administrations. Describe the Eastern network with enough specificity that modern scholars have been able to estimate station counts across different administrative regions. What is notable about this evidence is how mundane it is. Censuses, maintenance reports, supply inventories, staffing records. These have the texture of infrastructure documentation, not heroic chronicle. Under the command of. When administrative records, this procedurally boring, describe a system consistently across multiple independent bureaucratic traditions, under the command of. They are almost certainly describing something that actually functioned. Command of. This is the beat that matters, because the confident version of this story outruns the evidence. The yam is well attested, but the sources have real limits. The Persian chronicles were produced by scholars operating under Mongol patronage. They had structural reasons to describe Mongol administration favorably and to understate dysfunction. The Chinese records reflect the Yuan dynasty's project of presenting itself as a legitimate successor to earlier Chinese dynasties, which meant emphasizing functional governance. We do not have independent audit records or outside verification of how well the system operated at scale across its full extent. The failure rate, how often stations ran dry, command of. How often official couriers found stations abandoned or understaffed, is not recoverable from the current record in any reliable way. The brig under the command of. The total number of stations across the full empire is a figure that scholars of Mongol administration approach with caution. Estimates in scholarly literature vary considerably. And the degree to which the yam represented genuine Mongol innovation versus a systematization and expansion of earlier infrastructure is genuinely debated. Chinese states, before the Mongols, used relay messenger systems. The Abbasid Caliphate maintained courier networks. The Mongols appear to have scaled and unified these into something larger and more systematically enforced at empire-wide scope. But the line between adaptation and innovation is not clean. Historians who specialize in this period resist simple origin stories. Brig under the command of. The conquest dominates the narrative for reasons that have nothing to do with which story matters more historically. It has to do with who wrote, what they wrote about, and what got preserved. The most vivid sources on the Mongol conquests are chronicles of the defeated, Persian city annalists, Chinese court historians, Armenian clerics, Russian monastic writers. Command of. These are accounts of violence done to communities, and they are detailed, emotionally charged, and often written explicitly to be remembered. A city's destruction gets extensive treatment. The Yam station that replaced the city's former administrative apparatus gets a line in an inventory. Administrative records survive when administrations are stable and have archival infrastructure. The Mongol Empire fragmented after the mid-13th century into successor states. The Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in the Western Steppe, the Yuan in China, each of which maintained modified versions of the original relay system. The unified network ceased to exist as a single entity. Its documentation, where it was not already dispersed across multiple successor states, in multiple languages, largely did not survive the political disruptions that followed fragmentation. What the successor powers preserved was what was useful to them, under the command of, and they were not primarily interested in documenting the administrative genius of the unified empire they had replaced. Here is the argument. The Yam was the difference between a raiding empire and an administrative one. Conquest created territory. The Yam let the Mongols govern it. The 13th century contained other formidable military powers. The claim that the Mongols were uniquely capable warriors is harder to sustain the more closely you look at specific campaigns. They lost battles. They failed sieges. They were stopped in Poland, in Vietnam, in Japan, in Egypt. Command of. What is genuinely unusual is that the Mongol Empire administered territory at a scale and for a duration that no steppe polity before it had managed. That is not explained by cavalry tactics. The command of. It requires something that lets the center stay connected to the periphery when the periphery is thousands of miles of steppe and city. The postal relay made the orders arrive. The orders made the collection of taxes possible. The taxes funded the administration and the military of. The cycle is not unique to the Mongols. It describes every functioning empire. But the Mongols achieved it across a geographic scale that should have made it impossible. The unglamorous infrastructure is the story. The burning cities are how we remember it. Most of what we know about the Mongols is what they destroyed. Sources that survived are the sources of the survivors, and survivors write about what was done to them, not about the horse relay system that let the orders arrive. The Yam didn't outlast the empire that built it, but the principle did. Of. Every large empire that followed built something like it, under the command of. Sometimes the most consequential part of a story is the one no one named at the time. What survives is often what was useful to power, not what was true. Until next time.